The betrayal did not arrive with a blade or an ultimatum. It arrived with the chirping of a phone at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting on the veranda of my home in Daylesford, Victoria, nursing a cup of tea as the morning mist began to lift from the surface of the lake. It was a view I had spent decades earning. The golden light of the Australian sun filtering through the eucalyptus trees, the quiet rustle of the bush, and a sense of permanence that I had mistakenly believed was bulletproof. My son, Brad, was on the other end of the line, his voice polished with the brittle, rehearsed tone of a man who had already spent the profit he had yet to secure. "Dad," he said, skipping the pretense of a morning greeting, "we've made a decision. We are listing the cabin. You need to be out of the Kettner property by the end of the month." I am Jude Logan, 71 years old, a retired civil engineer who has spent his life measuring the load-bearing capacity of everything he touched, bridges, buildings, and, more importantly, the integrity of the people I raised. I moved to the Daylesford region in 1982 with my late wife, Renee. We bought a modest, split-level home on Mount Franklin Road, a place where we buried our golden retriever, Chester, in the backyard and planted saplings that eventually grew into the very canopy that now shaded my deck. I had built a life that was honest, deliberate, and entirely our own. But the cabin on the lake was the jewel of that labor. I had built it with my own hands over 3 long, hot Victorian summers, the wood still carrying the phantom warmth of the memories we made there. When Brad called that morning, his voice was not the voice of a son concerned for his father's well-being. It was the voice of a landlord. He had consulted a realtor in Ballarat without my knowledge, obtained an appraisal behind my back, and set a deadline for me to vacate a property he felt he had outgrown, both in sentiment and in financial utility. As he spoke, reeling off logistical demands and market projections, I felt the familiar, structured calm of my former profession wash over me. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I simply looked out across the lake and realized that the most dangerous thing a man can do is believe he is finished building. I am not a man who reacts. I am a man who responds. There is a fundamental difference in the physics of those two actions. A reaction is a spasm, a loss of control, a collapse under the weight of an external force. A response is a calculation. It is the engineering of a countermeasure. I looked at the screen of my phone, saw his name illuminated in the morning light, and understood that while Brad thought he was clearing the board for a new, profitable chapter, he had forgotten one crucial detail. He had inherited his father's last name, but he had entirely missed the lesson of how his father's mind worked. I set my cup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the table, and for the first time in 15 years, I began to see the life I had built not as a sanctuary, but as a structure that was long overdue for a fundamental redesign. The curtain had risen on a drama Brad thought he had written, but he was about to discover that I was the one who held the blueprint. The cabin on Lake Daylesford was never intended to be an asset. It was meant to be an anchor. Back in 1993, when I first purchased the lot, the land was little more than a tangle of scrub and uneven soil that most developers dismissed as unusable. My wife, Renee, had looked at the steep incline toward the water and questioned my sanity. "It is a lot of effort, Jude," she had said, her voice filled with that gentle, pragmatic skepticism I adored. I remember pointing toward the western horizon, where the sun seemed to anchor itself against the jagged ridgeline. "Give it 20 years, I promised. It will be where we keep our stillness." I spent 3 consecutive summers transforming that raw, unruly plot into a testament of patience. I hauled timber, laid the foundation stones myself to ensure the structural integrity against the shifting Victorian soil, and spent countless evenings under the constellations, nursing the wood and the stone until they felt like a home. Those were the years when Brad and Tim were young enough to believe that the world could be crafted by hand, provided one had the right tools and the resolve to use them. I taught them how to drive a nail straight, how to measure twice and cut once, and how to understand that the value of a thing is directly proportional to the effort invested in its creation. For years, the cabin served as the quiet stage for our family's evolution. It witnessed the boys' clumsy transitions into adulthood, the laughter of birthdays, and the somber, heavy silences of holidays after we lost Renee in 2015. After her passing, the cabin became a sacred vessel for her memory. I would sit on the deck as the afternoon light bled into the canopy, often imagining her voice carried on the breeze across the lake. To me, the walls were infused with the history of a life well lived, a structure built not on money, but on the quiet, steady accretion of days and devotion. Yet, as the years drifted by, I began to notice the subtle, corrosive shift in my eldest son. Brad's appreciation for the land changed. It morphed from a place of respite into a series of financial variables. By 2023, the conversations around my dinner table had become increasingly saturated with the jargon of investment and the cold, clinical assessment of capital gain. I watched him look at the windows I had fitted with my own hands and calculate their resale value. I saw him survey the timber deck and speak of renovation budgets, not for the sake of comfort, but for the sake of market positioning. It was a slow, invisible decay, the way iron rusts in the salty, coastal air. I had spent my life as a civil engineer, trained to spot the microscopic fractures that signal a looming collapse in a bridge or a high-rise. I had been foolishly arrogant, believing that I could apply those same engineering principles to the hearts of my own children, assuming that if I provided a solid foundation of ethics and hard work, they would inherently be immune to the rot of greed. I was wrong. I sat in that quiet house on Mount Franklin Road, looking at the photos of the family I had raised, and I realized that while I had been meticulously maintaining the roof over our heads, I had failed to notice that the foundation of our values had already begun to shift. I had been living in a house of memories, while my son had been living in a house of projections. And in that moment, the realization hit me with the weight of a leaden sky. If Brad truly wanted to treat his inheritance as a structural project, I would have to be the one to show him how things are demolished. It is a quiet, devastating realization to understand that the individuals you raised, those you protected from the elements and guided through the complexities of life, have begun to view your existence as a countdown toward their own gain. Following Brad's unsettling display of transactional thinking, I did not lash out. I did not engage in the exhausting, fruitless theater of a heated argument. Instead, I retreated to my study in our Dalesford home, a room that has remained largely untouched since Renee passed. There, tucked behind a heavy bookshelf, sat a floor-to-ceiling cabinet containing my professional archives and personal ledgers. At the very bottom lay a drawer that Renee, with a mix of humor and apprehension, used to call the serious drawer. It was a repository for everything that could not be reconciled with the lighter, everyday joy of our family life. Deeds, trust instruments, complex estate appraisals, and the cold, unvarnished records of a life planned with architectural precision. I opened the drawer, the wood groaning slightly in the silence of the room. It smelled faintly of old parchment and the sharp, metallic tang of ink. I pulled out a manila folder that I had not needed to consult for over a decade. Inside lay a deed to a property that neither Brad nor Tim even knew existed. It was not the cabin on Lake Dalesford. That was a public landmark, a shared space they felt entitled to dismantle. This was something else entirely, a legacy that had been meticulously placed into an irrevocable trust, shielded from the reach of those who prioritized gold over the ground beneath their feet. As I read through the clauses, my fingers traced the ink where I had designated the terms of its survival. I felt a strange, chilling sense of clarity. For 7 years, I had watched my sons visit the cabin, their eyes darting over the property with a predatory sharpness evaluating what could be sold and what could be leveraged. They had spent these years meticulously building a narrative in their own minds, a story in which I was a fragile, fading entity whose holdings were theirs to redistribute. They had mistaken my silence for senescence and my patience for passivity. They had no idea that I had spent the better part of those 7 years preparing for this exact moment. I sat back in my leather chair, the late afternoon light casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. I realized that my own trusting nature had, in a sense, been the primary structural weakness I had overlooked. By providing them with a life of abundance, I had inadvertently cultivated a sense of entitlement that now stood as a threat to everything I valued. I looked at the deed again and smiled, not with malice, but with the quiet, resigned satisfaction of an engineer who has finally calculated the exact point where the stress will cause the structure to fail. I had not been a victim in this process. I had been a strategist. I had been waiting for the exact moment when the weight of their own ambition would become too heavy to support. The time for observation had ended. It was time to initiate the sequence of events that would strip away the facade of their confidence, brick by agonizing brick, until they were left standing in the wreckage of their own calculations. 2 days after the initial shock, the expected call arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The weather in Dalesford was shifting, a gray, heavy mist rolling over the hills from the direction of the Wombat State Forest, creating a stifling atmosphere that mirrored the tension in my chest. Brad called at precisely 3 p.m., a time he likely assumed would catch me in the doldrums of a quiet weekend. I answered on the first ring, my voice intentionally neutral, a blank slate upon which he would soon project his own arrogance. "Dad," he began, his tone practiced, carrying that veneer of forced casualness he had perfected over the last year. "I've been doing some thinking since we spoke. I think you're looking at this through a lens of sentimentality, and that's fine, but Tim and I have looked at the numbers. We've had a consultation with Mark Benson, an agent out of Ballarat who specializes in luxury lakefront property. He's confident we can secure a figure nearing 400,000. I listened, my hand resting on the smooth grain of the kitchen table. He was performing, articulating a script he had clearly rehearsed with Tim, their voices likely echoing off one another in a private conspiracy of greed. "A realtor?" I asked, my voice steady, stripped of all inflection. "You authorized an appraisal on my property without informing me?" "We didn't want to bother you with the administrative side of things," he replied, his voice accelerating slightly, the sound of a man trying to outrun his own conscience. "We wanted to have the full picture ready for you, so you could make an informed decision. Tim is on board with this, Dad. We're doing this because we're worried about the maintenance, about the taxes, about your isolation out there." "And Tim," I said, interrupting the flow of his rehearsed justifications. "Is he there with you?" "Yes, he's on the line." I felt a brief, sharp pang of disappointment, not because of the betrayal itself, but because of the ease with which my younger son had been drawn into this theater of duplicity. "Tim," I said, the name sounding like a question in the quiet room, "is this truly your idea?" There was a muffled shuffle, the sound of phones being passed, and then Tim's voice, tentative and already stained with the guilt of the complicit. "Dad, we just think it's the right move. Financially, it just makes sense." I set my tea down. It was a small movement, but in the silence that followed, it felt like the tolling of a bell. "I have heard enough," I said. "I'm not interested in your market projections or your administrative convenience. I have invested 30 years into the life I have built on that lake, and I do not recall granting you the authority to liquidate my past for your future." "Dad, don't be like this," Brad interjected, his voice hardening into the petulant tone of a man whose plans had hit an unforeseen obstacle. "You're acting as if this is a personal attack, but it's just business. We're trying to look out for. I will call you when I have reached a decision," I interrupted, and for the first time, I allowed the weight of my authority to bleed into my tone. I hung up the phone, the sudden silence of the house rushing in to fill the void. I stood there for a long time, looking out at the fading light over the hills of Mount Franklin Road. I was not angry. Anger is a volatile emotion that burns out quickly. I was something far more durable. I was determined. I had spent my life building structures that could withstand the fiercest of Australian storms, and I realized then that my sons had mistaken my patience for weakness. They were operating on the assumption that I was a legacy to be claimed, a final asset to be harvested. They had no idea that they were currently walking on the very foundation I had laid for their own undoing. While the boys were fixated on the cabin at Lake Dalesford, convinced they were closing in on their only inheritance, they remained blissfully ignorant of the reality that existed 40 miles to the northeast. In March 2016, 6 months after laying Renee to rest, the silence of our home on Mount Franklin Road had become unbearable. I needed to escape the ghosts that inhabited every corner of our shared life. So I took my truck and drove without a destination, following the winding, treacherous roads that lead deep into the Victorian high country. I drove past the familiar townships and the encroaching suburban sprawl, heading toward the rugged, unforgiving terrain where the mountains become a wall of jagged shadow against the sky. It was there, tucked away on the edge of a pristine, unnamed alpine lake, that I found it. The lodge was not a cabin. It was a sanctuary carved from local stone and ironbark, perched on a ridge that overlooked the water. Unlike the Dalesford property, which had become a public landmark of our family's history, this place was nameless and untouched. It felt like a retreat from the world, a place where the air was thin, cold, and entirely clear. I bought the property in April 2016 for $260,000, a sum I had saved through decades of meticulous, unglamorous living. I did not purchase it as a vacation home. I purchased it as a fortress for my own peace. I took the extra step of placing the Garrison Lake Lodge into an irrevocable trust, the Renee Logan Family Trust, ensuring that its legal structure was as solid as the rock upon which it was built. I did not use the family solicitor who handled our routine estate planning. Instead, I sought out a specialist in Melbourne, a man of profound discretion who understood that some legal documents are meant to remain dormant until the precise moment of necessity. I told exactly one person on this earth about the lodge, my old friend, Walter Pruitt. Walter, a retired land titles officer who had seen every manner of deceit pass across his desk, knew the value of a well-kept secret. For 7 years, he held my confidence, never asking why I spent my weekends driving into the mountains while the boys played on the dock at Dalesford. All the while, Brad and Tim continued their visits, their questions increasingly sharpened by a covetous intent. They would walk the perimeter of the lake, pointing out sections of the dock they deemed unprofitable or timber that needed replacing, all while nursing the fantasy that they were securing their future. They were circling the wrong prize. They were so blinded by the accessibility of the Dalesford property that they never thought to look deeper into the map of my life. The high country property remained quiet, patient, and entirely hidden, waiting like a dormant volcano. It was the centerpiece of a legacy they would never know, a prize they were destined to lose before they even realized it existed. I had spent 7 years building a future they were not worthy to inherit, and as I sat on the veranda of that lodge, watching the mist descend upon the alpine lake, I realized that I had not just been protecting an asset, I had been engineering a moral education. The listing went live on a Wednesday. I know the exact day because Walter Pruitt, with his characteristic laconic grace, called me to confirm the news. Jude. His voice was steady, the sound of a man who had weathered decades of bureaucratic storms. The Lake Dalesford cabin has just appeared on the multiple listing service. Your son, Brad, is listed as the co-owner and vendor. The asking price is $390,000. I exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that carried the weight of 7 years of patience. How was the market responding? I asked. Walter did not hesitate. The interest is significant, Jude. Mark Benson is an aggressive agent, and he has already scheduled 3 private inspections for this weekend. They're moving with a speed that suggests they intend to finalize this before the month is out. Let it run, Walter, I said, my voice as flat and unyielding as a foundation stone. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind of stillness that occurs when a professional realizes they are witnessing the final turn of a long-played game. You're certain? If they reach the closing table and the buyers provide the deposit, the complexity of untangling this will be immense. I am entirely certain, I replied. Let them believe they have one. Let them exhaust their resources and commit themselves fully to this transaction. A structure that is built on a faulty premise will only become more unstable the higher you build it. I wanted the boys to feel the rush of the finish line. I wanted them to experience the intoxicating confidence of a successful heist, to reach the point where they could practically feel the cash in their palms. What neither Brad nor Mark Benson understood, what they had fundamentally failed to grasp in their haste, was the legal reality of the deed. Years ago, when I had set up the co-ownership as a gesture of ease for future estate planning, I had retained a specific set of rights that they had conveniently overlooked. In the state of Victoria, co-ownership is not a blank check for unilateral liquidation. It is a shared obligation that requires the absolute, documented, and verified consent of all parties to transfer title. Mark Benson, perhaps driven by the prospect of a quick commission or blinded by Brad's assurance that the family was aligned, had failed to conduct the most basic due diligence. He had taken Brad's word as gospel, treating a complex legal arrangement as a casual domestic favor. I watched the process unfold from the periphery of my life in Dalesford, observing them like a master builder watching an apprentice ignore the load-bearing requirements of a wall. They scheduled the inspections, they fielded the offers, and they eventually secured a purchase agreement from a professional couple from Toorak. Each step they took was a commitment to an impossibility. They were constructing an elaborate, polished facade over a void, and I was the only one in the room who knew that the floorboards were not nailed down. I did not move to intervene, nor did I provide them with the slightest hint of their error. I simply waited, watching the machinery of their greed turn, knowing that the sharper their anticipation, the more devastating the eventual silence would be. 2 weeks into the listing, the offer arrived, and Brad called me with a voice that was practically vibrating with unearned triumph. Dad, we've secured a formal offer from a couple in Toorak. It's a strong one, $382,000. They are motivated, and the deposit is ready to be transferred. I listened, my grip steady on the receiver, picturing him in his modern office in Melbourne, surrounded by the trappings of a life built on shortcuts. Brad, I said, my tone as calm as a mountain lake at dawn, have you verified the requirements for the closing documents? There was a slight hesitation, a flicker of doubt that he suppressed with the practiced arrogance of a man who believes he is beyond correction. It's just a formality, Dad. We have the title officer from the firm and the CBD ready. Because you're a co-owner, they simply need your signature to clear the transfer. It's standard practice. I did not offer him the reassurance he craved. Instead, I let the silence stretch, a heavy, suffocating weight that forced him to confront the instability of his own words. I will be there on the morning of the 3rd of December, I said, and we shall see if your formality holds under scrutiny. I spent that afternoon in a private meeting with Raymond Castillo, my solicitor, at his office in Melbourne. Raymond was a man of impeccable precision, a legal strategist who found no joy in the theatrics of the courtroom, only in the absolute, crushing power of the law. I laid out the entire sequence: the unauthorized listing, the misrepresentation of consent, and the impending closing. Raymond reviewed the deed, his finger tracing the specific clauses of co-ownership that I had insisted upon years ago. He looked up, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "Jude, your sons have committed the ultimate error of a novice. They have assumed that silence is equivalent to agreement. They have constructed a contract on air." I explained my requirements. I did not want to stop the sale beforehand. I wanted the closing to proceed until the very last moment. I wanted the buyers, the agent, and my sons to be gathered in that room, fully invested in the fantasy of their success, before the foundation was pulled out from under them. Raymond laughed, a short, dry sound of professional appreciation. "You are not just planning a legal maneuver, Jude. You are orchestrating an ending. I am merely holding them to the standards of the construction industry," I replied. "If you build without a permit, the structure must be condemned. It is not personal. It is simply the nature of physics." We spent the next hour meticulously refining the timing of the intervention. I left the office feeling not the hot, blinding rage of a victim, but the cold, surgical clarity of a man reclaiming his own narrative. Brad and Tim were walking into that boardroom, thinking they were the masters of their destiny, unaware that they were merely walking into an architect's study. The trap was set, the components were aligned, and I was finally ready to witness the collapse of the deception they had spent so long building. The evening before the scheduled closing, I invited Brad to the main house in Dalesford. I wanted to observe him on my own terrain, where the walls held the echoes of a life he had failed to understand. He arrived at 7, accompanied by that familiar air of expectation, convinced that I had finally surrendered to the inevitability of his plan. He walked through the front door with the stride of a man already measuring the resale value of the hallways. "Dad, I appreciate you doing this," he said, his voice dripping with a superficial kindness that made my skin crawl. "It's a tough decision, but it's the right one for everyone." I served him tea, watching the way he sat, not with the comfort of a son returning home, but with the impatience of a liquidator reviewing an inventory. We spoke of trivialities, the local weather, the state of the garden, the mundane architecture of a life he had effectively written off as obsolete. I played the part of the weary father, nodding in a way that signaled my continued participation in his charade. It was a disorienting experience sitting across from him, knowing that the trap had been fully set and that he was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was walking into the mechanism of his own undoing. "Brad," I said, interrupting his monologue about market trends, "have you ever felt that a structure can look perfectly sound on the surface, yet have a core that has completely rotted away?" He paused, his expression flickered, a micro-expression of genuine unease, before he smoothed it back into a gentle, patronizing smile. "Dad, you're exhausted. All this project work has you overthinking things. We have a wonderful outcome waiting for us tomorrow." "Do we?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, almost conversational. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what it takes to maintain a structure. Sometimes, when a flaw is buried deep enough, the only way to save the inhabitants is to condemn the entire building." He laughed then, a light, airy sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You have such a dramatic imagination. It's why you're so good at what you do." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt entirely free of his influence. He left the house confident in his script, while I stood in the doorway, knowing that tomorrow, the performance would be canceled for good. The morning of December 3rd arrived with a brittle, crystalline clarity, the kind of day that seemed designed to strip away all pretense. The law firm's office in the Melbourne CBD was a place of sterile elegance. Polished glass, dark wood, and the hushed, rhythmic ticking of a clock that served as the heartbeat of the building. Brad and Tim arrived at 8:50 a.m., wearing their best charcoal suits, their posture a masterclass in performative confidence. Beside them sat the prospective buyers, a couple from Toorak whose eagerness to secure the lakefront property was evident in the way they repeatedly checked their watches and reviewed their folders. Mark Benson, the agent from Ballarat, stood by the window, his briefcase open, looking every bit the man who had already mentally deposited his commission. I arrived precisely at 8:55 a.m., my presence noticeably muted. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were a surveyor observing a site before the demolition crew arrived. Brad greeted me with a firm, paternalizing pat on the shoulder, his smile broad and entirely hollow. "We're ready, Dad," he said, ushering me toward the mahogany table. "Let's get this behind us so we can move forward." I took my seat in the corner, keeping my coffee cup close, my movements slow and deliberate. The title officer, a poised woman named Paula, began the preamble, her voice a calm drone against the sudden tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. As Paula reached for the transfer documents, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, a signal from Raymond Castillo. I did not move immediately. I let the silence deepen until it became a physical presence in the room, until Brad's expectant smile began to falter, just slightly, at the edges. I stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that felt like a sharp interruption to their momentum. "I apologize," I said, my voice cutting through the professional chatter with an authority that silenced the table instantly. "There's a final detail that needs to be addressed before any signatures are affixed to these pages." Brad's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine irritation replacing his composure. "Dad, what are you doing?" "We're all here. The buyers have cleared the funds. This is just a formality." I did not look at him. I looked at Mark Benson. "A formality, Mr. Benson, is a structure built on firm ground," I said, my voice devoid of malice, but heavy with the weight of impending truth. "But today we find ourselves on significantly softer earth." I walked toward the door, where Raymond Castillo stood, holding his leather briefcase with the calm, terrifying poise of a man delivering a verdict. The room had shifted. The air felt thin, electric, and entirely devoid of the warmth of their earlier, greed-driven optimism. I turned back to the table, knowing that the performance Brad had choreographed was about to end, and for the first time, he would be forced to look at the ruins of his own design. The room in the Melbourne office had transitioned from a place of commerce to a scene of profound and irreversible displacement. Raymond Castillo stepped into the light, his presence as unyielding as a foundation stone. He placed two documents on the table with deliberate, rhythmic motions, the sound of the paper hitting the wood echoing in the sudden, absolute silence. The couple from Toorak, previously so vibrant with anticipation, sat motionless, their eyes shifting between the documents and the faces of my sons. Mark Benson, the agent from Ballarat, had retreated to the corner, his complexion rapidly losing its professional veneer of confidence. "Gentlemen," Raymond began, his voice devoid of any histrionics, "we are here to address a fundamental misunderstanding of property law. The Kettner property, or, as you identify it, the Lake Dalesford cabin, is held under a joint ownership deed established in 2009. Under Victorian law, the transfer of such a title requires the unanimous, written consent of all co-owners. That consent has not been provided." He pointed a steady finger at the unsigned document before Brad. "Your listing agreement was, by definition, a contract built upon an impossibility. It is unenforceable." The sound that followed was not a scream or a protest. It was the sharp, jagged intake of breath from the buyers as they realized their dream of a weekend retreat had been nothing more than a fiction. Brad remained seated, his hands gripped tightly around the edge of the mahogany table. His face had drained of color, his earlier, performative confidence having been replaced by a look of bewildered vulnerability. He looked at me, searching for a sign of hesitation, a hint of the tired old man he believed I had become, but found only a cold, analytical resolve. "You orchestrated this," Brad whispered, the accusation hanging in the air like smoke. "You let us get all the way here. You let us schedule the inspections. You let the buyers sit at this table, all to do this?" I did not deny it. I stood at the head of the table, my presence anchoring the room. I did not orchestrate the greed, Brad. I merely provided the space for it to manifest. You sought to liquidate a legacy you did not build, based on a logic you did not verify. You acted as if you were the architect of this transaction, but you neglected to read the soil reports. I gestured toward the room, encompassing the bewildered agent and the disillusioned buyers. You wanted a shortcut to a future you had not earned. Now, you must deal with the consequences of building without a permit. The room became a cacophony of quiet disasters. The buyers were already reaching for their phones to contact their own legal representation, their expressions hard and unforgiving. Mark Benson was fumbling with his files, looking like a man who had suddenly realized he had staked his entire professional reputation on a collapsing structure. My sons sat in the center of the wreckage, two men who had spent weeks planning their future on the assumption of my obsolescence. I turned toward the door, feeling no satisfaction, only the finality of a task completed. The illusion of order had been stripped away, and in its place, the raw, cold truth stood exposed. My sons had sought to dismantle my past, only to find they had inadvertently demolished their own prospects. The aftermath in the law firm's boardroom was a quiet, suffocating descent into reality. As the buyers and their legal team departed, the atmosphere grew heavy with the smell of stale coffee and the palpable scent of failure. Mark Benson, the Ballarat agent, had slunk out moments earlier, his silence as deafening as the legal implications of his negligence. It was finally just the four of us, Raymond, myself, and my two sons, who seemed to have shrunk within their charcoal suits. Tim had his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the realization that the world he had passively accepted was no longer the one he inhabited. Brad, however, was still staring at the unsigned transfer documents as if they might magically reconfigure themselves. "Is that it, then?" Brad finally spoke, his voice thin, lacking the sharp, arrogant edge it had possessed only an hour prior. "You've ruined the sale, you've humiliated us in front of the buyers, and you've opened us up to a breach of contract claim from the Marshes. You've successfully dismantled everything." I did not move. I sat at the head of the table, feeling the cold, hard edges of the chair beneath me, a stark contrast to the hollow promises he had been trading in. "I dismantled nothing that was not already crumbling, Brad," I replied, my voice measured and distinct. "You talk of ruin as if you are the victim, yet you were the one who drew up the plans for this collapse. You wanted to sell the Dalesford cabin for $390,000? You were so desperate to turn a memory into a liquid asset that you didn't even check the deed." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew the document that would finally shatter the illusion they had harbored for years. I didn't hand it to them. I placed it in the center of the table, letting the light from the window hit the official seal of the Renee Logan Family Trust. "You have spent years circling this cabin, acting as if it were the limit of my reach. You were so blinded by your own greed that you never looked beyond the borders of Dalesford. While you were counting coins in your head, I was securing a legacy that you have now forfeited the right to touch." I watched their eyes move across the document, the record of the Garrison Lake Lodge in the high country, a property they had never known, a sanctuary they would never set foot in. "That lodge was appraised at $1.1 million. I said, the figure hanging in the air like a final verdict. "That was to be your inheritance. Both of yours. It was the inheritance your mother would have wanted, and it was one you would have received if you had simply waited, if you had simply trusted the man who raised you. Tim looked up, his eyes glassy, the realization of what had been lost settling into his marrow. Brad looked at the document, his fist clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. A nonprofit? Brad whispered, having skimmed the successor beneficiary clause. You're giving it to a conservation group instead of your own sons? I'm giving it to a future that knows the value of preservation, I said, standing up. You treated your father like an obstacle to be cleared, and you treated your history like a commodity to be auctioned. You wanted the Dalesford cabin, and you have it. You have the maintenance costs, the legal liability of a breach contract, and the debris of your own hubris. You built this. I am merely leaving you to live in it. As I walked toward the door, leaving them in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of the room, I did not feel the triumph of a victor. I felt only the profound, melancholic clarity of a man who had finally finished his final and most difficult project. The path that led me to this moment was not paved with grand gestures or sudden epiphanies, but with the quiet, agonizing process of unlearning the person I had become to accommodate a life that was never truly mine. For years, I had built a structure of domestic harmony based on the assumption that my own silence and compliance would suffice to keep the roof intact. I had traded the bedrock of my own truth for the illusion of stability, believing that if I simply held the frame steady enough, the picture of our lives would eventually align. I learned, with the cold clarity of a professional, that you cannot anchor a home in the shifting, treacherous sands of someone else's deception. You must build it on the unyielding foundation of your own integrity. In the solitude of these past few months, I have discovered that peace is not merely the absence of conflict. It is the presence of clarity. My life is smaller now, in many ways. It is quieter, devoid of the social obligations and the performative perfection that once defined my years in Dalesford. But it is also infinitely deeper. I have regained the ability to listen to my own intuition, a faculty I had allowed to atrophy during those long, lonely years in a house that felt like a museum of someone else's curation. Every morning, as I watch the light move across the porch of the lodge at Garrison Lake, I am reminded that freedom is not an end goal, but a daily, deliberate practice. It is the conscious decision to acknowledge that you are the sole architect of the walls you choose to inhabit. I think often of the cabin on Lake Dalesford and the simple life Renee and I once envisioned. The darkness of the recent chapter is something I will carry for a time, not as a burden, but as a map. It serves as a permanent, objective record of how quickly one can be erased from their own narrative if they are not vigilant. Yet, I refuse to let that experience define the man I am today. I have a profound responsibility to the future, to the quiet integrity I have rediscovered, and to the person I am becoming in the aftermath of the storm. On the days when the weight of the past threatens to linger, I turn to the simple, uncomplicated honesty of the lodge. There is a profound, meditative quality in these mountains. If the pieces do not fit, the structure will not hold. It is a lesson I have applied to the architecture of my own existence. I am no longer forcing parts together that were never meant to align. I am curating an existence that is honest, sustainable, and entirely congruent with my own values. Tonight, as I sit on the west-facing veranda and listen to the wind moving through the ironbark trees, I feel a sense of completeness that I once thought was reserved for fiction. My life is my own again. The lodge is quiet, the air is cold and clear, and for the first time in decades, I'm not waiting for the foundation to fissure. I'm simply here, fully present, standing on the solid, honest ground of my own making. I have finally learned the most vital lesson of all. You do not find peace by changing the world around you. You find it by finally becoming the person you were always brave enough to be.